Everybody, welcome. And, Tom spoke about community, and the SVA is a community, MPS Digital Photography is a community, photography is a community, and Wendell White is a part of all of that, because Wendell White is an alumni of the BFA photography program here at the School of Visual Arts. And he has an MFA degree in photography from the University of Texas at Austin. He's also taught photography at SVA, at the Cooper Union and International Center of Photography in New York City, and at Tom's and my alma mater, Rochester Institute of Technology. So he's checked all of the great academic boxes. Currently, Wendell is the Distinguished Professor of Art at the Stockton University in New Jersey. He has received numerous awards and fellowships, including a 2021 Robert Gardner Fellow in Photography, a John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, 3 artist fellowships from the New Jersey State Council for the Arts, a photography grant from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, and a New Works Photography Fellowship from Enfoco. This evening, we are honored to welcome Wendell, who will share insights and processes from a variety of his projects, including Small Towns, Black Lives, Schools for the Colored, and Manifest. So please help me in welcoming Distinguished Professor Wendell White.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Katrina. That's so kind of you. A very generous introduction. So I appreciate it very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank you. I want to thank SVA and the I3 program and series for this invitation and opportunity to talk about this work. And I am looking forward to hopefully some questions or opportunities to have a conversation at the end of the talk. Hopefully there are things included in here that are about both form and content, the nature of the things that have interested me, the way in which photography is an end result of a set of ideas for me. And hopefully those ideas are spark some conversation about a wide range of topics. But the central concern in these projects, and I admittedly am picking a few that have been central to my practice for a while, are the ways in which the African American community is evolved over time and represented in the photographic image. So I'm not going to talk too much more without putting some images up and starting to talk about this work. And so let me get started with that. And so as was already mentioned, I'm going to just show a few images from 2 projects, Small Towns, Black Lives, which first began for me in 1989, and then Schools for the Colored. And the reason I wanted to show some work for this is to place some context around where I am today with the type of images that I'm making and where the process of thinking about and representing the Black community has evolved over time. This started out really as an interest in a small community in southern New Jersey. This is one of the first photographs I made in the summer of 1989 of Mrs. Gladys Spalding. And one of the things that happened in retrospect was that we began talking about her experience in the community, and gradually I realized I hadn't set out to incorporate these narrative text panels, but I gradually realized that there was a whole world that was invisible in terms of what could be represented in the photograph. And so for the first time in my practice, I began incorporating text, and that kind of goes back and forth over time. But for the projects today, these are the only ones that represent that. One of the things, and we'll come back to this in a minute, that we talked about, Mrs. Spalding and I, was the school, which was right down the street from her home. And it was at one time a segregated one-room school for African-American students in this small Black community. This was an important conversation that would lead to other projects, but it was also a conversation that emerged throughout this entire project. This project goes on for approximately 12 or so years before it came to a conclusion. And during that time, a number of things occur and come up as ongoing themes throughout the project. But one of them was the presence of the school in the landscape and the way in which Black lives are represented in many ways. And one of those ways is through architecture and landscape. Simultaneously, right about the same time, and this is a small, and you're seeing essentially all that's left of what was once a Black community, which is a small cemetery at this fork in the road, actually not too far from the university where I teach. And so you get a sense of the rural setting, the degree to which this is a fairly remote place, although not very far from major centers. It's close to the Jersey Shore. It's not very far from Atlantic City, about a half an hour. It's less than an hour from Philadelphia. So it's not wildly remote, but at the same time, these are undeveloped areas. This small community, and all that was left of the community were these headstones, had once been an African-American settlement within what was and is today an all-white community, historic community that goes back to the Revolutionary War. So this is a community that was established in the early part of the 18th century, before the Revolution. And in the middle of the 19th century, a small group of African Americans began to settle in this community. All that I had were these headstones, and this is the point of this, is to sort of talk about how this led me to research and how it led me to the archives. The information that I include is information that I was only able to obtain through traveling to various resource centers, primarily the National Archive in Washington, D.C., but also local archives in the county offices and areas like that. There was no documented history of this community. It had all basically been lost. Everyone had died off, and all that was left were these 5 headstones. The other thing that was a little bit lucky for me, and again, I was looking at the archive, was that I came across this real estate map, which had been drawn in 1872 by Beers, Comstock, and Klein. They were a New York-based map-making company, and they often sold their services to counties. This is as a real estate map, it basically showed many of the individual homes and the names of the people that lived in the homes throughout the county along the roads. And so what this provided me with was an exact picture of where the different members of this Black community lived and what the configuration of that community was. And it was the first time I had seen that. Nobody really had any information. The homes were gone. It was all fully overgrown. And so there was no even sense of where the structures had once been. Again, only the headstones remained in the cemetery. So this started my interest in the thinking about how the archive might be a place to reveal, and research might be the basis for producing work and thinking about work. Very late in the process, this led to a museum exhibition at one point with a large catalog, an exhibition that traveled for about 5 or 6 years of all of these images, about 70 images, and other installation related kinds of material that traveled around. Catalog is about 150 pages long. And but close to when all of this was coming together, one of the members of the Port Republic community came forward with these photographs that actually represented 2 members of this Black community as they had been pictured in a school picture in approximately 1911, according to writing on the backs of these photographs. This was just before the community really dies out. By the 1920s, there's no one in this Black community living there anymore. But this also became the basis for me thinking about the schoolhouse and the importance of the schoolhouse in our society. Port is a very small community. The school is actually not much larger than this today, with just a couple of classrooms and a number of students. They don't have their own high school. They sort of send their students to the next nearest community for high school, but they have kept their primary school. The thing that was remarkable was that I already knew that many of the schools in southern New Jersey were segregated, but this was such a small community with such a small Black population that there was no economic basis for, creating a separate school and teaching, even having a separate room. I've come across schools where Black students were taught in a separate room from white students within the same building as a means of having some sort of segregation. But Port was so small that it wouldn't have really worked for these two students. So it was oddly in this community that was pretty and remains a pretty racially isolated and separated community even today. It was a kind of remarkable moment of integration within that community that didn't really survive in that way. But having come up with that real interest in the school, I then turned my attention gradually towards, thinking about the schoolhouse and the landscape. And Schools for the Colored as a project, one that has also been exhibited and traveled around quite extensively, is one in which I eventually made images and did the research and found the locations of buildings that had served as segregated schools for the Black community throughout the, 19th, primarily 19th and into the 20th century, up to, technically only up to 1955 and Brown v. Board of Education, but many schools remained segregated after that, right? Because of a range of residential segregation patterns. And of course, there are some that are almost as segregated today in that regard. But the thing that was interesting to me about these schools was the fact that I had started in New Jersey, and so I was only looking at schools in the North. I decided I didn't want to. We know that, the Southern United States is a place that has a kind of, iconic memory of slavery and enslaved African Americans and racism and the civil rights era and all of those images. But we often overlook the way in which the North is a very deeply segregated, and often communities are often very racist in the North. And some scholars make the point that segregation as an idea, a construct in the United States, is really more a Northern construct than it is a Southern construct. And that's another conversation. But these buildings became interesting to me. The project photographs the buildings in the North between the Atlantic Ocean, where I started in New Jersey, and the Mississippi River in Illinois. So East St. Louis, right across the river from St. Louis in Illinois, is the westernmost location of the schools, and then all throughout the states, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, along the southern portions of those states. This is in southern Illinois. This is Indiana, Columbus, Indiana. And in this case, as this is the only one I'm showing, but throughout there are 50 images in the project, 10 for each state. And in a number of places, the school was no longer there. And I either was able to find a photograph of the school or a description of the school. If I didn't have a photograph, I created a shape that seemed like it would match what was written about the school in various documents, and replace it into the landscape in this way. You can see that the surrounding area is got a screen over it, in a sense, a white screen. And that comes from the process that I was using at the end of Small Towns, Black Lives, and is inspired by the notion set forth by W.E.B. Du Bois that, and it comes from a childhood experience in school, that there was a veil that existed between the black and white world, that he lived in a world on one side of the veil and he could see through it, but it was a separate world. It was a world apart. And so each of these structures has been placed in a world apart from those other locations. This is also Indiana. This is Lyle Station, Indiana. This is actually a kind of an interesting, I tried to pick different types. So one that's missing altogether. This is one that was almost entirely demolished. It's in what's one of the few black farming communities left in the United States. And through support actually from the nearby Toyota factory, hundreds of thousands of dollars were poured in, and they rebuilt this in its original appearance. And it is divided between one half of the building is a historic recreation of the classroom as it once existed. They went around and found furniture and all the things that would have been in the school at the time. And the other half has become a community center and a sort of a museum for the community. And so it's both a preservation of the history of that school, and at the same time, it became a functional space for the community. But it is remarkable to step inside the classroom because it looks like a 1930s, 1940s maybe classroom. All of the wooden furniture, all of the things that we would have seen in the classroom during the sort of heyday of segregation. And this is in New Jersey. This is Cape May, New Jersey, one of the most southernmost points. And this is also another element that's interesting for me in the history of these schools, in that many communities like Cape May built substantial schools. This is a pretty, two-story building with multiple classrooms. And what's remarkable is I've talked with members of the Cape May community that attended this school that are still living today. Many people are still living today that attended these segregated schools. And they talked about the way in which they would walk with their white friends to school in the morning. And when they got to this corner, they would go into this school, and their white friends went to a white school literally across the street. And so it wasn't a situation where the school was, farther away. So in the Whitesboro school that we looked at earlier, that was a, school in a town that was isolated and separated. Here we're looking at a structure that was actually located inside the same community with the white school, literally across the street from the white school. This is Yellow Springs, Ohio. Took me a second. And this is Charlestown, Pennsylvania. It was a black coal mining community. And this is what's left of their school. So all of that, both of these projects were very research-driven, research-based in that regard, and it required a good deal of time, probably more time, in terms of finding out what I was going to photograph and where it was, than the actual amount of time. The photograph was the end result of that. And that eventually led me to the Manifest project, which I've been working on for a little over 10 years as well at this point. Some of these projects are happening simultaneously, one on top of the other. And it started with this photograph. And it was during actually the time that I was teaching at RIT. I had gone with the idea that I was going to work on a landscape project about the beginning of the NAACP, the Niagara movement. I was going to make some photographs in that vicinity, and I wound up stopping in at the University of Rochester's special book collection, and I wound up talking about Frederick Douglass, because Frederick Douglass is buried there in Rochester, and that was another thing that I was interested in. And they brought out, this is the first book that Frederick Douglass purchased after becoming free of slavery. It's in their collection. And that moment of encountering this book was so remarkable to me that it just totally redirected this project that was going to be a landscape project into a still life project, in which I began looking for, seeking out the lives of African Americans as they have been held in various collections, primarily public collections, a few private collections, but primarily public collections. The book, by the way, is the works of Robert Burns, and it was in the narrative of the book is, and that story that comes with it is actually written into the front of the book as Douglass gave this book to his son. He indicated this was this first book that he bought after he became free of slavery. The other thing that emerged at the same time in this experience was that I became aware of the degree to which Black bodies also exist in the archive as well. And this is the first experience with that also at the University of Rochester. And this is a lock of Frederick Douglass's hair that they have in the collection. And so I was just astonished that this would, first of all, be something in a university library collection at that time, although I have to say I've come across locks of hair in many collections, so I'm not so surprised about it anymore. But at that moment, I hadn't been thinking about, you know, the library as a place that would be a repository for these fragments of Black bodies that were left behind. And of course, Frederick Douglass, you know, if you are familiar with the images of him, and he was, I think, the most photographed person of the 19th century, he had this, you know, remarkably big head of hair. And so the idea that hair would be a memento from somebody like Douglass was also a remarkable component of this. I also came across another lock of Frederick Douglass's hair, this time at the Nebraska State Historical Society. There was a woman who had been a runaway slave and was raised in Douglass's household. And she, when she, you know, left, grew up to a certain point, married, and wound up moving to Lincoln, Nebraska. And there is a whole sort of sewing box of mementos from her. And in that are several locks of hair from the Douglass family. This is Frederick Douglass. This is Frederick Douglass Jr. At 3 years old. And this is Rosetta Douglass. So a number of images, and there are many locks of hair. I just wanted to show a few of those. Very close to where I live in Philadelphia, there is a museum called the Mutter Museum, and it is the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. It's been around for quite a period of time, well back into the 19th century. And they have many items in the collection that relate to African American history, although they don't have a specialty in that. But they were really generous with me in terms of helping me locate things that were in their collection. They don't always have, you know, as much cross-referencing for topics such as African American culture, because they are a science museum. And interestingly, talking to one of the curators early on, he sort of misunderstood my goals and objectives. And he said, well, you know, I was welcome to come and photograph some things, but he said, you know, almost everything that they had was gray. And I said, well, that's actually perfect. I mean, I'm not necessarily looking for representations of, you know, the traditional notion of Black skin, but digging deeper into the scientific and the pseudoscientific ways in which Blackness has been dealt with. This is actually a sample of intestines that was the basis for one of the early 1849 discoveries of a strain of cholera that was rampaging through the colonies at the time, or now the United States by the middle of the 19th century. But this particular piece of intestines has been hovering in this solution since 1849. And in this particular case, for various reasons, this skull got labeled Negro as a way of differentiating a racial idea in this particular case. The museum is divided into two sides, and they actually refer to it as the library and the wet side. So all the like body parts and stuff like that is on the wet side in the museum. But the library is also a remarkable place to begin looking at and thinking about how Black culture and Black people, African Americans, Africans broadly in different parts of the world were being viewed by the scientific community. And this is also a remarkable, this text is called America's Greatest Problem, colon, the Negro. And it is, these are all texts by physicians and scientists and other people working within this field of thinking about biology and anatomy and et cetera. And one of the things that is important about this particular image for me, as difficult as it is and as painful as it is, and I will say that throughout the images that we'll look at, we will go back and forth between images that are painful and images that represent a tremendous amount of agency and accomplishment in the Black community. And that is something that I want to talk about at the very end. This is a way in which I wanted to begin, finding connections to talk about also the idea, because we struggle with the idea of systemic racism, we struggle with the idea of institutional racism. And it is important to look back sometimes and see that, very supposedly neutral entities within the society were looking at, Black people and Black culture with a deeply, biased perspective, a deeply biased way of looking at things. And this is, almost the stereotype that you would expect from a menstrual object or document, yet it is in a scientific text. And so I thought I would tie that with, the popular culture objects that grow out of these ideas, right? So on one end, there's a scientific text and a scientific discourse that's looking at these kinds of things, and it inevitably leads to, thinking about African Americans more broadly in that context, and inventing and deciding what it really meant to define race was certainly critical at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. These are, and I'll just mention this because everybody may not be familiar with Kenneth and Mamie Clark were sociologists, Black sociologists in the beginning of the 20th century. And they worked on the questions of racism and how race was perceived by children, looking at the early ages and saying, when do we start developing these ideas about race and preference in race and what we today would think of as internalized racism that we then take on internally. And they are the sociologists, African-American sociologists, that their studies were the ones that were used in Brown versus Board of Education, because their studies were based on the idea of using these two dolls. So these dolls come from them, but they actually had dozens and dozens of these that their researchers and investigators took out into the field. And in giving them to children, one of the takeaways was that even Black children preferred the white doll because they were offered these dolls. Which doll would you like to play with? Which doll is the prettier doll? Which is the doll that you want to have? And overwhelmingly, white children chose the white doll, but also Black children chose the white doll, because already at that age, the understanding of the general, benefits of whiteness were understood by children already. And so these were part of that, part of the Smithsonian collection, and part of the article that I worked on with them for the magazine at the opening of the National Museum. This work with the Smithsonian was probably the most difficult They were super nice to me. They were very nice and very generous and really worked with me. What was most difficult about this was this is the only place, with one or two exceptions on one or two items, but this is the only place where everything that I photographed, I was not allowed to handle. Only they could handle it. And the generous part was they, never indicated the slightest, annoyance at the number of times I asked for something to be moved a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, or could we try that again, or, push it further back. But for the most part, a couple of things at the Peabody Museum that were very rare, I could not handle. But for the most part, everywhere I go, I'm allowed to handle the things that I photograph. And I always have interesting conversations because some places require gloves, some places don't require gloves, some places require vinyl gloves, some places use cotton gloves. So fascinating how much this all starts to feel a little made up as you go along in terms of the preservation. This section I didn't really title. I actually started the title and I took it away because this is the material that I've come across that is, some of the most painful material. It's the material that deals with the enslavement of Africans in the American society. And so also as part of the Smithsonian photographs, this was a pair of slave shackles that I photographed for them. This is a slave collar. This is actually at Rutgers University in the Alexander Library in their collection. And while objects move around the country, it is important to recognize that most places throughout the United States up until the Civil War, did have some use of slavery, in northern states as well. So we think of slavery as a Southern institution, but it was an American institution. There were slaves in New Jersey, there were slaves in New York, there were, slaves in Ohio, there were slaves in many different parts of the United States. Northern states started to abolish slavery earlier than in the South before the Civil War, but nevertheless, slavery existed throughout the United States. This is a coin that was excavated by an archaeological dig at Harriet Tubman House in Auburn, New York. A curtain ring from the same archaeological dig being done by Syracuse University at the Tubman House, and a spoon. And I include those in this because those are all part of the American narrative of slavery in terms of Harriet Tubman's story. And this is a Sojourner Truth, narrative of Sojourner Truth. The title page was printed for her in 1850. And interestingly, we think about self-publishing today. The 19th century saw quite a bit of self-publishing. Self-publishing is not, just the invention of the current moment where we're able to do it relatively efficiently through digital means. Self-publishing was something that was going on all the time. And I've come across so many, especially these slave narrative texts, were often self-published. And then the individual, like Sojourner Truth, would go on a book tour with her books and sell the books to kind of recover, the money for that. And it's just a kind of remarkable idea to see and think about how that intersected. But obviously, in this particular case, she's telling her story about coming out of slavery. This is actually a deed of ownership, for a slave. It's at Duke University. This is a estate listing that transfers slaves from the owner to his heirs after his death, and they're in there, and we can't see it on the screen at this point, but that's part of the text listing them. They are in this estate listing. They are worth $700. And this was one of my the things that I thought was interesting that really reinforced this idea. It's very sort of vague, but it's the power of these kinds of innocuous documents that really transmit the idea. And this is an insurance policy for slaves. And so one of the things when we try to talk about the idea that there is a sense to which, enslaved African Americans were treated as property, it is very important to realize that as property, you would, insure your property. And so one of the industries that existed, and this happened to be a company called Charter Oak Life Insurance in Hartford, Connecticut, but it was a slave policy, and only the slave owner would benefit if the slave died. Money didn't go to, the slave or their children or anything. This was purely for the slave owner to recuperate the investment. This is a shell from the Civil War at Fort Sumter. It's in the also in the Alexander Library in Rutgers. This is a postcard to recruit African Americans to fight in the Civil War. So this is this slow evolution of the way in which African Americans begin to liberate ourselves from slavery, not just that, that this was something that, was given to African Americans. And then, of course, it introduces other complexity. This is a women's Ku Klux Klan hood. There was a separate wing of the Klan that was the women's auxiliary, essentially. And this was from a unit in New Jersey. They met at Convention Hall in Atlantic City quite openly in the 1920s. And in the mid-1920s, the Klan in New Jersey held an alternative Miss America contest in Asbury Park on the beach. 4,000 people attended, and it was called Miss 100% White America. And so as a way of sort of grappling with those ideas, but I think that, we tend to think of the sort of, angry, brutish men that, are the Klansmen that are out there, doing bad deeds. But there's also, it's also important to recognize the role of women in that as well. This was a sort of a powerful point, and I think we have some political representatives today that help to remind us of that degree of cross-gender activity in hate and racism. Moving a little bit forward, this is back to the Smithsonian. This is a shard of stained glass. It was part of the church window at the 16th Street Baptist Church, with the that church bombing resulted in the killing of 4 Black girls in that church. And this is a ceremonial coffin, which was built by a group of artists / activists in Ferguson, Missouri, after the death of Michael Brown, and it walked through the protests. It is covered with mirrors, a lot of it damaged, of course, at this point, but it was intended to, symbolically reflect all the people standing around and sort of being part of this grieving process for the loss of Michael Brown. I'll go very fast. Photographs became a very important part of what I was interested in. This is the first one, and I just was astounded by what it became like to photograph photographs in this way, to treat them as objects, but not as images, in a sense. I was looking at the surfaces of them, looking at the way they are managed and maintained and kept, and a whole range of different things. And of course, the image was important as well. That first one was from Jamestown, New York. This is Frederick Douglass. This is an ambrotype. This is a photograph that I made. This is a image of the aftermath of the lynching of Will Brown in Omaha, Nebraska. And I included here because even though I'm not going to show these today, it is the beginning of my interest in Red Summer, which is yet another project that I worked on. This took place in 1919. And so when I encountered this in the Historical Society, I began thinking more about that year and all of the racial violence directed against Black communities. This is in Iowa. It's a local doctor, African-American doctor, Black abolitionists. This is from a photography studio in Asbury Park, New Jersey. And these are, just images of people that came in to have their photographs made. This is a photograph of actually a multi-ethnic, multiracial community in the middle of Iowa from the 1950s, which was a really remarkable and unique kind of a community. Many people talk about the way in which at one point in time, Iowa was an almost thought of as a progressive place, and how over the decades it has, sort of transformed. And this was interesting evidence of that for me. I love this. This is just like a graduation ring, a celebratory moment. So thinking about, other ways in which the photograph might be used. And then I'd encounter photographs in collections, but they were contemporary reproductions. And so one of the things that I also began to do was to photograph these negatives. This is a glass plate negative, because of wanting to have the original thing in front of me, wanting to have the thing that was connected to the past more directly in front of me. Paper is critical. These are materials. This is a map of Eatonville, Florida, home of Zora Neale Hurston. This is the manuscript by Zora Neale Hurston of Their Eyes Are Watching God. It's the Beinecke Library at Yale. This is a sketchbook from Zora Neale Hurston. It's at the University of Florida, Gainesville. This is a Bible owned by a former slave that lived in New Jersey. A diary at Cornell that discusses slaves that lived within the former slaves that lived within the community. This is from the WPA, various writers' projects to study different things around the country. And this was the Negro in Iowa. This was also a turning point for me in a way. While I was in Nebraska, this is the FBI files, microfilm of the FBI files of Malcolm X. So all the files on Malcolm X that the FBI kept stored on microfilm, and they have it in Nebraska because Malcolm X is from Nebraska. He was born in Omaha. But what was a turning point for me was at first when I saw this, I was a little disappointed. I thought, oh, these pristine white boxes, they're really, not what I'm looking at so often. I'm looking at things that show the way in which people, have come in contact with this. But then I really became very excited by the idea that this, all this information was hidden from us inside these boxes, and it was hidden in a way that looked like it was very sanitized. It looked completely unused. It looked as though no one had ever opened these boxes to look at and investigate these particular set of files. And so I have really, over time, become very fond of this image because of the power that it conveys in its sterility and in the way that it's so much unlike a lot of the other historical materials that seem to have a patina that can be overly romanticized sometimes. Another small diary, graduation from Meharry. That's an African-American medical school in Tennessee, I believe it is. I think it's Tennessee, where Meharry is. This is, and I always don't have the whole title because it's like 2 or 3 sentences long, but this is the Thomas Clarkson book on the history of the abolition of the slavery of African people, and then it goes on and on and on. And it's published by the British Parliament. And that little piece of paper sticking out is the famous illustration of how slaves would be stored within the hull of a ship, and everybody, sort of has seen that, and this is where it comes from. And this is the text that was published in 1808 in England, as they were, coming to the end of their involvement with the slave trade. And this is one of the things I actually look for these in different collections and start to add them as I go along, because I'm interested in, who in the United States was reading this book, from 1808, thinking about the abolition of slavery. A lot of things that I photograph are really quotidian, and I just am fascinated by everyday objects. This first few objects are also from Eatonville. It was actually part of a special project on Eatonville that I worked on, and a number of different photographers and artists, particularly photographers, a number of photographers worked on this Eatonville project as a way of, honoring and recognizing Zora Neale Hurston. Things as ordinary as a door handle, a lunch bucket, a watch, gold watch. And back in Nebraska, small things that were left behind in what had once been a Black History Museum and had sort of fallen into decay. It was no longer open, but I was able to get access to a number of the objects in there, a local newspaper, the cover of a family Bible, a drum from a band. Big bands were very popular in the Midwest, and something as simple as a child's jump rope, a quilt. And then not too long ago, I had the good fortune and opportunity to work with the Paul Robeson House. That really was through the Art Center of Princeton, and in collaboration with the Paul Robeson House. Paul Robeson was born and lived the first couple of years of his life in Princeton before the family moved. So there are a couple of homes that are sort of dedicated to his memory. One in Philadelphia, I think, and there may be another one somewhere else as the family moved around. I was really fascinated. They are pulling a lot of things out of this house and starting to think about, starting to work on creating a center there where folks can come and do a wide range of social justice things. And they wanted me to photograph some of this stuff that was basically almost detritus, but nevertheless, things that had lived inside that house for many, many decades since the beginning of the 20th century. And it just seemed like these things really were able to narrate something for me about different moments in time, different ways in which these materials may or may not have intersected with Paul's life in some way, but nevertheless, sort of carried something forward for me in that regard. And I should say also that at this point, I want to just make one note about the transition. Hopefully it's seamless, but because of a variety of different things having to do with the discontinuation of a film that I was using, this project goes from 4x5 color negative film in the very beginning, in the early Rochester images, to a digital back attached to a view camera, actually one of the little Cambo things, because I realized I still needed the movements and the adjustment in terms of focal plane and a range of different things like that. And so I, struggled with that for a little while, and different sort of, things that have come together, but it's sort of settled on this combination of, mid 20th century view camera lenses attached to a contemporary body with a digital back on the back. And it's sort of a Frankenstein kind of concoction, but it has allowed me to keep a feeling that has made the images consistent. And in fact, I'm actually seeing these objects through the same lenses that I always have. And so that has been part of the process as well. And then circling back a little bit to the notion of the importance of school, this is a report card from in the Princeton Public Schools. And the interesting and complex piece of this is that Paul Robeson's father was a Presbyterian minister for the Black church in Princeton. And at one point, Paul's brother, older brother, wanted to attend Princeton. And so his father went to the president of Princeton University to see whether he would be allowed to attend. He would live at home in town. He wouldn't live on campus, wouldn't have to, integrate the dorms in any way, but he wanted to get permission. And not only was the president, not only did the president of Princeton turn him down, he basically arranged to have him removed from his position because the Princeton essentially was the financial underpinning for the Presbyterian church in the Black community and essentially paid his salary. And so he was basically, and this is why Paul Robeson leaves Princeton, essentially his family is basically kicked out, his father loses his job. The president of Princeton at the time was going to eventually become the president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. And so who brought for the first time segregation into the federal workforce. And so the federal workforce had not been segregated until he became president, and he brought that idea that the workforce should be segregated. So that way in which it gets baked into the system is remarkable, and it one story after another, it just happens going forward. This is just a pouch that would have held smoking tobacco. And then I've also had the great pleasure of photographing a number of remarkable things. James Baldwin's inkwell, Radio Raheem's boombox from the movie Do the Right Thing, segregated bus station waiting room sign, a flute for, and not many people, this is another interesting piece, this musician by the name of Thomas Wiggins, who traveled around under the name Blind Tom. He was an African-American man who was blind, and he was wildly popular and played concerts all over the place. And one of the things that made him so popular was that he could reproduce accurately any piece of music he heard one time. And so there were often, performances where somebody would bring, a piece of music to try to stump him, and he'd hear it one time and be able to play it perfectly after that. He was unfortunately, he was exploited by his management, and he didn't benefit from all of the popularity and income that came in. But that's, not a new story. Staying with music, this is one of Jimi Hendrix's vests. A door from Katrina. And even though this is not necessarily a moment that is as celebratory as some of the other things in this section, I still find it a moment in which, in spite of a tremendous difficulty and hardship, a large portion of the Black community, was able to recover. And even for all the people that were lost, many people were able to rebuild their lives. So it's a powerful, it holds on to two things at the same time. Tape recorder used by Malcolm X at Mosque number 7 in Harlem. A protest poster from the 1960s March on Washington that is uncomfortably familiar in terms of the requests that's being made inside the poster. We demand an end to police brutality now. And so some of these narratives aren't so new as people would have, people believe these are things that have been on the wish list for the Black community for a very long time, maybe in fact the entire history of it has changed over time, but the entire, in terms of the way it's executed, but over the entire history of African Americans in the United States. And I wanted to end with one picture to also say that the whole of this is really quite complicated, because the way in which race and racism plays out is endlessly remarkable, endlessly painful, endlessly complex in terms of the different iterations. This is actually a very new piece. It is a chart constructed by a scholar, a woman of color, at Harvard University in the 1930s when she completed her master's degree. She was working under the supervision of a white scholar, well-known, internationally known eugenist scholar by the name of Hooton. And Carolyn Bonday, this is the physical chart. This physical chart was ultimately reproduced in her master's thesis, in offset reproduction in her master's thesis. But what she did was she traveled throughout the South and she researched the racial makeup of 300 families that were of individuals of mixed race heritage. And the charts contain information that includes, and you can see a little bit of along the top, it's very hard to see, they're very small, but the percentage of Negro blood, the percentage of Indian blood, and the percentage of white blood, as written as fractions. And sometimes the fractions are remarkable. They're like 1764. So, I mean, the degree to which the imaginary notion of racial makeup was being, sort of concocted was complicated here. And in reading some of her material, especially reading her letters to Hooton, I realized that in many ways, she often tried to push back a little bit on some of the things that he wanted her to do as a scholar. For instance, he wanted her to measure people's heads, and she, just said, that won't be possible, and I won't be able to do that, because she understood that that was too intrusive for the community, for essentially the Black community. The complicated part of this is that she was also thinking that this was, in a sense, evidence of a successful and elevated portion of the Black community that often happened to contain a mixture of white heritage. And she was always gathering this information from everyone. And so she herself, I think, fell into that very unfortunate notion that there was this hierarchy, and that the hierarchy, that she wanted to make sure that people like herself would benefit from that hierarchy and being understood as better than. But at the same time, she wanted to, produce honest work, and she looked at a range of different things. And in many ways, her work sort of disputes the notion that any one percentage makes a particular difference. Pretty much all of the people, all of the 300 families were families that were successful. And so one of the premises here was that she was working with people that led successful lives in one way or another. And that didn't necessarily have to mean great wealth, but owned a home, had employment, had, all the sort of basic things that one would expect, and we're not, you know, suffering the worst indignities of the Black community in terms of menial labor, in terms of not being able to have any home ownership, not having all the some of the things that went along with middle class life. And what's remarkable as well for me is that this brings together so many of these things that I've been looking at and interested in visually, which are the way in which this hair is collected, and then photographs and data collection. All of it is sort of colliding. All of it is colliding in this chart, and there are dozens and dozens of these charts. Not all of them have the hair. Most of them are genealogical. So there's a photograph and a line. This person is the parent and this person is the son. And, you know, there are a range of those kinds of things. But there are a number of these charts that include hair samples as evidence. You know, the hair is evidence of, you know, the quality of the hair meant a quality person, right? So if you had better quality hair, you know, might have characteristics that would elevate you in the society. And these are ways in which we measured each other, and probably still do measure each other under certain circumstances. And certainly people struggle with the contemporary notion of, you know, what hair should look like in the workplace. And, you know, for unfortunate kids that are, you know, trying to maybe wear a natural hairstyle in athletics, wind up getting their hair cut by, you know, adults that are, you know, just not, that are just being ignorant of what it represents, but they're at the same time not fully being ignorant. They are acknowledging that there is something that's not white about certain ways in which hair is worn, certain ways in which hair is presented, and that in and of itself is disturbing in many parts of our culture today. So I say all that to say that I have felt all along that this work is about the contemporary moment, but it's also about, you know, by looking through these historical materials. I think that's probably more than you wanted to know about all that stuff.
Oh, Wendell, thank you so much. First of all, I want to say your students are so lucky to learn from you, because I'm like, we need a semester with Wendell and not a 60 minutes.
Right.
And to no surprise, in many of the questions, your work is so tactile.
Right.
You know, and the blackness, I'm assuming, of velvet, the light.
Right.
I mean, it's, in a way, this is going to sound, they're luscious photographs.
Right. Right.
And so we have a question from a student, Yu Chen. Why are you photographing with such, in a way, shallow depth of field? Isn't it important to show all the details and all the information? So
Right.
can you talk a little bit about that,
Sure.
please?
Sure. I want the photographs. I realized from the beginning that I wanted the photographs to do something different than this sort of documentary photograph that a scholar might use that shows, like, this is the thing, and the photograph will give you all the information about the thing. And so what I always do is provide detailed titles and captions are very specific. The full titles and captions include a description of the object as it is described by the collection, the name of the collection, and the location of that collection. So, you know, lock of Frederick Douglass's hair, Rush Rees Library, University of Rochester, Rochester, New York. It's cumbersome and it's long, but that becomes part of the revelation. The other part, the photographic part, is part of a few things. One, it's because I want to possibly for myself, maybe for others, but for myself, transmit this idea that I am, you know, traveling through time, looking at things and looking at things as they exist in this way. I also want to point up the way in which these are materials that have been obscured and overlooked and hidden and put away, sort of, and out of sight in many cases. Although in recent years, since I first started in 2008, I mean, in recent years, there's certainly been a lot more attention paid to the importance of material culture, Black material culture, and the way in which the role that that material culture plays, the architecture, the landscape, you know, a range of different things. But I really do feel like that the one of the goals of the photograph is to, in some way, transmit that experience that I have when I'm in front of the object in a very specific way. And also from a formal point of view, you know, I'm also not feeling like I'm obligated to do anything, you know, overly descriptive in that way. I'm still working out the problem of solving a visual problem and producing an image that is satisfactory to me. But hopefully, if it's frustrating for the viewer, that frustration leads to, you know, go find out about that thing, because you have I've given you all the information. I'm not keeping the information from you about what it is, where it is, how to find out about it. You have everything that you need to go find out as much as you would like to find out about that object, whatever it is. So I always feel like that side of the process is the part where I balance that out. Yeah.
Well, I was Googling some of your references and I got
Right.
stumped with Zoronio Hurston. Obviously, my spelling was way
Oh,
off.
Zora Neale, sorry. I'm like maybe Zora Neale, right.
Oh, my goodness.
Zora
Yeah, no
Neale.
wonder Google was like, I give
Right,
up.
right. She's a fascinating, I mean, for those of you that haven't read Their Eyes Are Watching God is a wonderful narrative. She was a writer and had a great deal of success early on during sort of Harlem Renaissance, and then sort of fell out of favor and was rediscovered sort of, you know, kind of actually after she died. She died penniless in a nursing home in Florida. But she has, many people have returned to thinking about her and thinking about her work. And it's, again, she also represented a kind of complicated place in African American literature and intellectual thought, because she, and I think one of the reasons, I mean, this is my own personal thought about why she sort of fell out of favor, is that at the time of Brown versus Board of Education, she was writing op-eds for the newspapers opposing integration. She felt that the African American community should live like the Native American community, apart from the white community. She felt the white community in this country had never been particularly, you know, kind or supportive of African Americans, and what was going to happen to these children going into, you know, white schools. Were they going to be, you know, treated in that way? And she, you know, I think that at that moment in time, for an African American to sort of go against the effort that was a, you know, community-wide effort to end segregation, it just was, you know, too far outside the mainstream of, you know, Black cultural effort at the time.
That's impressive. I will definitely look her up now that I know what her name is.
Yeah.
We have, once again, some process questions here from
Sure.
Jason Roblando. He says, hello, Wendell, can you talk about your approach to archives? And I'm how much time do you have? But really, do you have like an idea of what you're going to photograph? Do you have a plan, or is it sort of like,
right,
welcome to the candy store?
Right. So it's a little of both. a matter of fact, on Thursday, I'm headed to Johns Hopkins to make some photographs and at their special collections. And I often have this conversation with archivists and librarians, et cetera, people that are helping me pull material, which is, and the two things that I say is, one, I don't know in advance whether or not I will be interested in the thing once I see it. I mean, I can be interested in it because the listing in the finding aid is, like, oh yeah, that should be interesting. But then when I get there, I may see the thing and find that there's not something that I feel like I can respond to visually. It's not something I, am, drawn to, or that I have a good visual solution for. On the other hand, I often encounter things that are, that I don't expect. And so part of the answer is yes, some of it is, I just have to be there. I have to look at the things. I have to make the photographs. And I mean, finally, I would absolutely admit that I sometimes, even when I'm making the photographs, I don't know how I will feel about it until after I finished editing and looking at it and thinking about it. And, that was the Malcolm X, microfilm. I mean, I was happy with the photograph. I mean, that's not the question. The question was, did I think that was still what I wanted to do? Did it resonate for me? And it took me a little while. It was not until, after I got back and I looked at it and lived with it for a little while, that I saw how valuable that kind of image could be in the types of pictures I was making. So yeah, I don't know.
Well,
I mean,
that's sort of,
I do know. I mean, I've developed skills at finding material, at kind of having a hint at what I'm looking for, knowing what kind of search terms to use when I'm using a finding aid, knowing that almost every collection has stuff that's not in the finding aid. And so you are going to have a conversation with somebody that says, oh yeah, we've got this stuff we haven't had a chance to catalog yet. And it turns out that's the most interesting stuff that they've got, So it's knowing all of those pieces that, it's not just looking up, doing a search for the stuff and determining. And for African American culture, it's knowing that you have to use a lot of search terms that, we don't use in today's language, because you're looking at material, that was being produced, in at the beginning of the 20th century, the 19th century, the 18th century. And so you have to really sort of use, I think, a very broad spectrum of thinking about how did people describe race? How did people define race at that moment? What are some of the possibilities for extracting, the evidence of race in the 19th century?
well, those are issues that we're, I'll admit, are all grappling with today.
Right.
Also, working,
Right.
talking with people. We have a few questions that are directed for the students.
Yeah.
As you might have heard, this week they were introduced to the thesis project. They don't have 10 years to do it. Maybe this might be a start of a 10-year project, but Tom wrote, he's very interested in how the project your work has shifted from landscape to still life.
Right.
And as our students start their thesis projects, do you have any advice that you can think of that they might need to hear on how to be flexible and be open and go to where the project leads them?
Right. Sure. I mean, and that is a huge challenge. And I realize I have a tremendous luxury that comes from, being able to work in the way that I work. And I, am grateful for the institutions that have been part of my life for a long period of time, and for the, sort of financial support that has come from grants and fellowships and things like that, that give me a huge amount of freedom. So I have to start with that and recognize that piece of it is an important piece for me. But I think that for me, it always is the result of thinking about what is it that as I said early on, the photograph is the end result of a set of ideas. I am not using photography at this point in my life, but I certainly think that I did when I was much younger. But at this point in my life, I don't use photography as a way, and I think it turned out to be a more contemporary notion of photography as a way to just go out and explore the world. And I think there are, great photographers that do that. I use it as a way to manifest, not to just overuse that term, but to manifest the idea that I have about something, or the question that I have about something. What is this thing? What is going on with that? So I have relied on literature a lot. I, certainly have done quite a bit of reading, and, use literary references. And I've talked about W.E.B. Du Bois along the way. And I think about how can I, find and make that tangible? How can I create a tangible outcome around those ideas, express those ideas? So I think of it like writing an essay. I start with a particular thesis idea, and then start to pull it apart. Well, who else has written about this? Who else has thought about this? And I look for every possible way in which scholars and intellectuals and artists have looked at it. So, it might be in a literary form, it might be in the form of other photographic projects, it might be in the form of other kinds of art projects altogether, not necessarily just within photography. And so I try to, take as much as I can. I mean, I also would add that over time, I realized that I flattened out a lot of those different categories. And so right now, my proposal for this fellowship was to continue making these still life images for Manifest, but with a landscape construct laid on top of it. So the set of images that I will finish with are going to be a collection of pictures taken within the 13 original colonies. So it has a geographic component to where all this stuff sits in the American landscape. And part of that also, I was involved with the Monuments Lab folks in Philadelphia, and they were thinking already about 2026 and the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. So I was already starting to think about, oh, okay, well, what that was, thinking, let me think back, colonial framework, and put a landscape box around these, still life images. And so I'm still making those same images, but with a constraint now, a specific constraint, that I'm going to stay within New Hampshire to Georgia.
What I'm hearing is, yes, the research, the depth, the expertise, being open to the process,
Right.
And not letting a preconceived notion, because we know how destructive that can be,
Right.
to guide you.
Right.
Okay, I like try to let speakers end, but one more question.
Sure.
And it also has to do with thesis, and it comes from Marco. He observed, since your projects have so much to do with images and text and their context, do you feel that there's an ideal format for presenting them, be it a book, an exhibition, a lecture?
Right.
How do you tie these together? Is there an ideal for you?
Right. I don't think that I have an ideal. I try to stay pretty open to, and in fact, I really have, I think, developed in myself a idea that I would take in suggestions from people around me about how something might exist or how it might work. The folks down at Blue Star in San Antonio, when we were exhibiting Manifest there, the curator at the time said, have you ever thought about, creating a set of prints that we will put inside vitrines? And so they built these vitrines so that people could almost experience like opening the drawer and finding the object inside. And that was a collaborative, notion. I didn't, go to them with that idea, but they came with that forward. And other ideas have come out of these kinds of conversations in terms of publication and different things. And, we'll set limits from time to time when people want to, transform something, in a way that's too far. But more often than not, I have found that, if I think about it a little bit, I can find a way in the conversation with the designer or with the curator or with the publisher to, hear what they're trying to say and find a way to still feel that my work has the integrity that I want it to have within that context.
That
So
is that is the word, integrity.
right. Right.
And because one last question for Tom, the historian.
Yeah.
Were the Malcolm X original documents destroyed after they were microfilmed, or is there another FBI file?
Oh, I'm sure there must be. I can't imagine that the original doc. I mean, I'm thinking that they probably are in the National Archive at this point in time, unless there's, because in the sense I could look at them on the microfilm, so they're obviously declassified to the extent that they appear on the microfilm. Whether or not there is an unredacted, version of them that's accessible to anybody, I'm not sure about that. There's something right now that they're struggling with trying to get, released about some files from the past. I forget what it is exactly, but
Yeah, that would be January 6th.
no, not, right. Yeah,
No, I know.
that too. But yeah, no, I'm thinking like, Vietnam War era or something like that. There are these, various kinds of ways in which these documents sort of disappear, and then somebody says, wait a minute, what did you do with those? And then next thing you know, they're like, well, they're still classified, but I would think that at this point, most of the Malcolm X stuff has been declassified, but at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if, there are still troves of material that the unredacted material, may still not be accessible. Yeah.
So I want to really thank you. I know it's a long day for everybody, but this has been such a pleasure. I mean, visually, intellectually, historically, there's so much to chew on, a terrible term, but so much to think about, and how important, like the history, the person, the skill, the integrity is to your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.